Finance Committee will come to order. The committee meets this morning to discuss the challenges and opportunities in stepping up our economic ties with countries in Asia and the Pacific. The Indo-Pacific region accounts for half the world's population. It's full of like-minded democracies and growing economies. As one of the gateways to the Pacific, Oregon has a lot to gain from this opportunity. 1 in 5 jobs in Oregon is trade-related, and those jobs often pay better than do non-trade jobs. When you look across the Pacific, there are big markets for everything from Oregon blueberries and alfalfa to manufactured goods to services. Raising environmental standards and ensuring robust labor rights in the region could have also given us the opportunity to level the playing field for American workers. Last fall, the Biden administration kicked off an effort to develop a wide-ranging economic framework with several countries in the region. There's a long way to go before any such framework comes together, so today's hearing gives the committee an opportunity to discuss key issues and priorities at the outset of the process. First, the United States must fight hard for a free and open internet. The U.S. sees the internet as a venue for free speech and commerce. Authoritarian governments like China don't. The competition between those two visions is a fight we've got to win. Otherwise, Americans get hit with a 1-2 punch. First, authoritarian regimes block our exports, and then they export their censorship laws to us. The most significant example is the Chinese government and the Great Firewall. When the internet began to take off decades ago, Americans were the first out of the gate, launching companies with big, innovative ideas. The Chinese government decided it couldn't compete on that level. Instead, it blocked our firms, ripped off our ideas, and started clone companies under tight censorship rules. As those Chinese tech firms have grown, the reach of their censorship has grown also, with repressive effects on the American people. The Chinese government is still not a part of the Indo-Pacific discussions, nor should it be. Even still, winning the fight for a free and open internet requires the United States to push for digital rules that lock in freedom and openness with our allies at each opportunity. We know, Senator Crapo and I have talked about this, there's bipartisan interest in fighting this censorship. So our committee is going to watchdog this issue very, very closely in the days ahead. Second, our country has to raise the bar on labor rights. Democrats in Congress fought to make sure that the recent Usmca would be the strongest agreement in history when it comes to worker protections. We have to build on that progress with enforceable labor obligations to fit the region and the task. That includes combating the scourge of forced labor. That's been a priority for the committee. The truth is, forced labor and economic oppression overall are part of the Chinese economic model. It's not only morally repugnant, it's a threat to American workers and jobs. Senator Brown and I closed a major loophole in our forced labor law in 2015. Now we've got to make sure that's fully enforced. While the United States continues to fight against forced labor in China, it's also essential to prevent a race to the bottom on labor rights in other countries also. Labor rights and environmental protections often go hand in hand. For example, there is a big need for strong new rules on subsidized fisheries. In some parts of the world, highly subsidized and poorly regulated fleets are abusing workers and massively overfishing. It's not sustainable. Everybody loses, including the abused workers and Oregon fishing families who should never have to compete with forced labor. Third, in all areas of trade policy, we believe here that sunshine is the best disinfectant. In 2015, this committee raised the bar for transparency in trade negotiations because the American people expect it. That means consultations with Congress and access to the text of any agreement before it is signed. Senator Crapo and I have talked about this. We're Westerners. And for years, you'd go home, you'd have town hall meetings, and people would ask about trade agreements, and nobody in the Congress knew what was in them. So we have to make sure that the public has access to text of agreements before they're signed. These new discussions in the Indo-Pacific region have to meet that transparency standard. Let me close on one final and very important point. While the committee meets for this hearing, there is a horrible war happening about 5,000 miles to the east. The events of the last weeks show the importance of our economic alliances as well as the power they generate for the United States and our friends around the world. In this unprovoked, unjustifiable war, Vladimir Putin has killed thousands of Ukrainians, displaced millions, and decimated cities. Our country has marshaled the collective strength of our economic allies to hit Russia with the most severe economic sanctions in history. Russia's economy is now in free fall. The country is isolated. Vladimir Putin is the head of a pariah state. This is proof that strong economic alliances add up to a whole lot more than soft power. The United States is putting the power to work, punishing Russia's government and helping in the fight for democracy. The more economic allies America has, the better. We thank our our witnesses for joining the committee today. There are lots of issues for us to discuss, major challenges ahead, and let me recognize my friend, Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I appreciate your holding this hearing today, and we are in agreement on the importance of strengthening our economic and trade ties, particularly in the Indo-Pacific area, but across the globe. Vibrant economic and trade links are an essential part of building confidence, trust, and cooperation in different areas of the world and at different levels of geopolitical engagement. Putin's invasion of Ukraine makes it abundantly clear that the United States must increase its focus on strategic trade engagement, and as a part of that, reestablish its leadership on trade relations in the Indo-Pacific region. For the first time, in January of 2022, the United States exported more liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Europe than Russia did. Although there is much more we can do to expedite U.S. energy exports, our increased trade strengthened our allies' ability to withstand Russian aggression. Critically, the Department of Energy must still sign off on any LNG export to any country with which we lack a free trade agreement, causing uncertainty for many of our partners. This is just one example of why we need more trade agreements with our partners. And the Indo-Pacific is one region, maybe the one region, where we need them ASAP. The Indo-Pacific is a dynamic region, perhaps the key to U.S. economic prosperity. Over 2/3 of all global economic growth in the last 5 years took place in the Indo-Pacific. The GDP of just the 11 countries in Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or what we call the CPTPP, is over $10 trillion. Regrettably, we are losing ground in the Indo-Pacific. Behind me are two maps comparing whether China or the United States is the more important trade partner for a particular country. The 2002 map shows the United States as the more significant trading partner for most Indo-Pacific countries. The 2018 map shows the relationship turned upside down in China's favor. Even more regrettably, the situation with China in the Indo-Pacific region is likely to become worse, if not entrenched, unless we change course. The Biden administration failed to initiate any new trade negotiations last year, but China helped finalize the trade agreement that it backs. Known as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, RCEP lacks any disciplines on state-owned enterprises, labor, or the environment, and worse, it essentially endorses China's limited intellectual property protections. With RCEP having only entered into force this January, China is already better positioned than the United States in most of our Asian partners' markets. On top of that, China is now pushing to join the CPTPP, which would lead the United States even further behind in the Indo-Pacific region. To reestablish the U.S. economic momentum right now, the Biden administration must reverse course and chart an ambitious trade policy. Although the administration announced that it seeks to pursue an Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, it unfortunately indicated that this framework will not include any market access component. Certain aspects of what I'm hearing about IPEF are troubling, including the notion that it could be used to advance the tax deal the administration negotiated at the OECD that would make the U.S. less competitive, even before Congress agrees to accept such an outcome for the United States. The administration's present position of leaving out a market access outcome makes no sense. Economically, our workers, businesses, and farmers will lose out on important opportunities if we stay on the sidelines. America's leading innovators will also be undermined if we do not lay down a foundation for a strong intellectual property right system. In fact, one way to redress the economic impact of the administration's current misguided inflationary policies is to promote market access. Export-oriented jobs typically pay 16% more on average in the manufacturing industries and 15.5% on average in the services industries. We must strategically deepen our trade ties to ensure we and our allies have secure access to energy, critical minerals, and sensitive technologies. We must also develop rules for digital trade that enshrine openness and freedom. If we do not write the rules, China will. Accordingly, this hearing is an excellent opportunity for the Finance Committee to help chart the course for the United States, the course that the United States must take to have a strategic and sensible trade policy in the Indo-Pacific. Mr. Chairman, once again, I thank you for organizing this hearing, and I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses.
Thank you, Senator Crapo, and I know this is another area where we've got an opportunity to bring this committee together and proceed in a bipartisan way. Ms. Sharon Bomer-Lauritsen of Washington is the founder of Ag Strategies, LLC, a specialty consulting service on U.S. agriculture trade policies focusing on expanding exports of American agricultural products in food and beverages. And she has extensive experience in government as well. Ms. Emma Lunzo of Washington is director of the Center for Democracy and Technology's Free Expression Project, where she has been doing good work to promote law and policy that promotes internet freedom. Ms. Kelly Shaw of Washington is a partner at Hogan Lovells, lecturer at Columbia Law School, and she has a deep knowledge of international trade, investment, economic law, and policy drawn from her service at the White House, the Ways and Means Committee, and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. And Mike Wessel is well known to this committee, president of the Wessel Group, a public affairs consulting program, and advisor to the USTR and the Department of Labor. He also serves as an original member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and we've known each other for many years, going back to his days on the staff of House Democratic Leader Richard Gephardt. So we've got a terrific panel. Let's start with you, Ms. Lauritsen.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Minority Member Crapo, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to share my thoughts on the challenges and opportunities for America's farmers and ranchers in the Indo-Pacific region. I appreciate you making my full written statement part of the record. One key element to enhancing the sustainability of American farms and ranches is investing time, energy, and ambition to negotiate new trade agreements to increase our competitiveness and open export markets. And there's no better place than to focus on the Indo-Pacific region. But the unfair barriers to U.S. agricultural exports in the region are many, both regulatory and tariff. Even if non-tariff barriers are resolved, U.S. agricultural exports, including to countries such as China, Thailand, and Vietnam, are often at a disadvantage when our products face higher tariffs in countries that already have preferential tariff agreements with U.S. competitors. We know that preferential trade agreements benefit our farmers and ranchers. One quick example, U.S. agricultural exports to South Korea have increased 54% since implementation of our FTA in 2012. We are celebrating its 10th year anniversary this week. The administration's recently announced Indo-Pacific Economic Framework provides an opportunity to create a fair and level playing field for our exports in the region. But to have meaningful impact for fair and resilient trade for U.S. food and agricultural products, I view the following elements needing to be considered for what I call IPEF. First, the administration has already identified science-based agricultural regulation as one pillar of IPEF. We need disciplines to ensure food, animal, and plant health and safety, measures known as SPS, and those in standards area like labeling, known as TBT, are backed by science or international standards and are not disguised protectionism. Consideration, however, should be given to providing least developed countries assistance to meet SPS and TBT plus rules. Another element of this pillar would be to gain commitments from trading partners to not create new unwarranted trade barriers in the future. Second, establishing strong SPS, TBT, and other rules, such as on import licensing, however, is not enough. Using IPEF to actually resolve unwarranted, non-tariff barriers is important up front so that U.S. farmers and ranchers can actually realize improved trading conditions in the near term. Third, many of the Indo-Pacific countries have high most favored nation agricultural tariffs compared to the U.S. average applied tariff of about 5%. I recognize the legal limits that the administration may have in negotiating U.S. tariffs without trade promotion authority. But even if Congress does not pass TPA in the near term, opportunities exist to negotiate with our trading partners to lower MFN tariffs, including to U.S. levels to help level the playing field. Fourth, IPEF can define a common vision on agricultural sustainability, sustainable food systems, and food security. And to advance sustainability, supporting the use of new agricultural technologies with appropriate regulatory systems would be of benefit to farmers throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Fifth, international trade is obviously one element in building stronger foreign relations in the Indo-Pacific region. IPEF should bring in as many countries together as possible, since the more inclusive the IPEF is, the stronger our economic ties and foreign policy objectives will be in the region. And finally, sixth, our traditional congressionally approved FTAs have dispute settlement mechanisms built into them. To have any meaningful or real results, IPEF provisions also need to be enforceable, and of course, USTR will then need to do the follow-on work to enforce them. With more than 20% of agricultural production being exported, our rural communities in all 50 states depend on finding strong, stable, and predictable markets. U.S. trade agreements do just that, and I believe that with creative thinking and ambition, the IPEF can also have economically meaningful results for a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Alonso.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Emma Alonso, and I am the director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3 charitable organization dedicated to advancing civil rights and civil liberties in the digital world. At CDT, I have worked for more than 12 years to promote law and policy that support Internet users' rights to freedom of expression, access to information, and privacy in US, Europe, and around the world. So I am grateful for the committee's focus on the promises and challenges in the digital sphere that will arise as the United States pursues closer trade relationships in the Indo-Pacific. Over half the world's young population lives in the Indo-Pacific region, and the region accounts for a little over half of the world's Internet users. Internet use in the Indo-Pacific region is expected to grow to up to 3.1 billion users by 2023. As Chairman Wyden noted, there is an urgent need to counter the authoritarian model of Internet regulation promoted by the Chinese government. China's use of Internet shutdowns, its decades-long project to build a great firewall that blocks outside information sources, and its mass and discriminatory surveillance of its population threaten human rights and impede the development of an open digital economy. A lack of respect for human rights and weak rule of law in China mean that it is extremely difficult for U.S. companies to operate responsibly in the country, which has only further cemented the Chinese government's grip on its domestic communications network. The past 3 weeks have also provided a stark example of the threats to human rights from digital authoritarianism in the context of the Russian government's invasion of Ukraine. The Russian government has blocked access to social media services that dared to attach fact checks to state propaganda and has passed a new fake news law that prohibits anyone from knowingly disseminating false information about Russia's military, which includes referring to its actions in Ukraine as an invasion. As a result, many media outlets have left the country and many online service providers have shuttered their services or are blocking access by Russian users, leaving the Russian people with few information alternatives to state propaganda and strengthening the government's control. Unfortunately, there are an alarming number of recent laws and legislative proposals across the Indo-Pacific region that also seek to control speech and access to information, subject internet users to surveillance, and give state authorities control over internet infrastructure. The Indian government has imposed more internet shutdowns than any country in the world, with 109 shutdowns recorded in 2020 alone, often in response to military crackdowns or protests. And the 2021 information technology rules in India put employees at risk of being jailed if companies do not respond promptly to takedown orders. If the IT rules are likely to serve as a model for other legislation in the region, Bangladesh, for example, has already proposed similar guidelines, and Myanmar is currently preventing the staff of telecom provider Telenor from leaving the country while it considers the sale of the company. The U.S. has the opportunity, including through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework discussions, to promote an alternative model of internet regulation and advance a rights-respecting, multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance that ensures the participation of civil society and technical experts in the development of technology policy, and that prioritizes maintaining an open, interconnected internet in the region and worldwide. It is vital that the U.S. promote the rule of law and seek commitments to uphold international human rights, which are essential to countering digital censorship and surveillance practices, and which in turn benefit the economy. Online service providers and other businesses need the legal certainty that comes from the rule of law in order to operate globally. And when national regulations comply with international human rights obligations, they both protect people's rights and bring economic benefits by more closely harmonizing regulations across borders. To be clear, this does not mean that the U.S. government should go easy on U.S. tech companies, or that they should challenge every regulation passed by another country as a trade barrier. In order to be a credible leader on internet policy issues worldwide, the U.S. must get its own house in order, including by passing comprehensive federal privacy legislation, reforming its intelligence surveillance practices, and by addressing competition and concentration within the tech industry. For the U.S. to successfully promote the free flow of data and to reject overly restrictive national data protection or intermediary liability laws that can serve as vehicles for censorship and surveillance, the U.S. must model a rights-respecting vision for the internet. And other nations must be able to have confidence that, for example, their citizens' data will be protected from government and corporate abuses when sent to the U.S. Globally, the U.S. should seek to build on existing commitments to digital rights, including through the Freedom Online Coalition, which was launched 11 years ago and which the U.S. was a founding member. The U.S. should seek additional commitments from governments in the region to refrain from imposing internet shutdowns or general monitoring obligations, to reject extra-legal censorship, to limit the use of surveillance technologies, and to ensure access to end-to-end encrypted services. The U.S. should also promote opportunities for shared learning across governments and with the involvement of human rights advocates, technical experts, and other civil society representatives, especially around emerging issues such as artificial intelligence. The IPEF process should coordinate with a variety of such learning and information sharing fora that already exist across the U.S. government, including the EU Technology Trade Council and the Freedom Online Coalition. And the IPEF process could develop cooperation mechanisms on specific topics between the U.S. and governments in the region. For example, support increased information sharing on ransomware and other emerging cyber threats, modeled after the U.S.-EU Joint Initiative on Ransomware. In short, there are a great many opportunities to defend human rights through engagement on digital trade issues and a powerful need for the United States to advance a vision for how to do so. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Let's go on to Ms. Shaw.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss U.S. trade and economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific, which is the world's most dynamic region. Prior to my current role in private practice, I was privileged to spend a decade in government service negotiating with our trading partners in the Indo-Pacific. So while I draw upon these experiences, the testimony I provide this morning is solely my own. How we structure and nurture our economic relationships in Asia today will go far in determining whether the United States remains the world's leading economic power. But the stakes are about more than just whether the United States will continue to be number one. Democracy itself is under threat, not just in Europe, but in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The rise of autocracy and state capitalism threatens our economic values and freedoms every bit as much as the political freedoms that undergird successful democracies. Historically, trade has been one of the most important tools for pushing back against authoritarianism. The United States led in creating a post-war global trading system that for many years helped drive U.S. jobs and growth and widen the circle of freedom and prosperity. Now, at a critical moment when democracy is under threat, we've retreated from our leadership role and abandoned our long-standing view that countries that trade together are less likely to go to war against each other. Trade is a difficult issue for democracy, but rather than take the lead in defining a new approach for today's challenges, one that strengthens U.S. manufacturing, unleashes innovation, protects our workers, and advances our values abroad, the United States has given up saying anything at all. We've become mired in our own domestic politics. As a result, today, the United States has no meaningful offensive trade strategy. In no place is this current lack of strategy and leadership vacuum more dangerous to long-term U.S. strategic, economic, and commercial interests than the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is our backyard, filled with military allies and important trading partners. Two-way trade with the region totals upward of $1.75 trillion. But when it comes to our economic vision, the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific has turned into something we say rather than something we do. This year, as the ranking member pointed out, the largest trade agreement in history, RCEP, encompassing 1/3 of global GDP, 15 Indo-Pacific countries, 53% of world exports, and 2.3 billion people, entered into force with China and not the United States at its helm. Moving forward, Beijing and not Washington will have outsized influence in setting future standards and regulations for Asia and the Pacific. Lower tariffs, common rules of origin, and eased custom procedures will help China lock in regional supply chains, attract new foreign investment, and expand its Belt and Road Initiative. U.S. manufacturers, workers, and farmers all stand to lose from the deal. And if China manages to accede to the other major regional trading bloc, the CPTPP, the results for U.S. economic interests will be catastrophic. Multilateralism will not save us. The World Trade Organization is on the brink of irrelevance after 2 decades of atrophy. Regionalism and regional trade rules are now king. Even before RCEP, more than 50% of global trade occurred outside the WTO system through more than 300 bilateral and regional trade agreements. 75% of the EU's trade, for example, is governed under these preferential agreements, which means the world is moving on without us. The recently announced Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a modest step in the right direction, but risks turning into another failed exercise. Few details have been announced regarding participating countries, the scope of modular commitments, or how the project will be more robust than CPTPP without any significant trade components. It is difficult to imagine IPEF having a meaningful impact on long-term U.S. economic interests without enforceable commitments on market access, rules of origin, technical barriers to trade, services, IP, investment, or state-owned enterprises, to name a few. A trade pillar focused exclusively on digital trade, forced labor, or trade facilitation is not enough to extract meaningful concessions from our trading partners or shape the region moving forward. Congress should push the administration to broaden its ambition so that we are setting rules, not merely making suggestions. Instead of starting from scratch, the United States should also seriously consider rejoining the CPTPP, and to do so quickly. Despite some of the deep fundamental flaws of its predecessor, the TPP, many of the provisions in the original deal were groundbreaking. It would be straightforward enough for the United States to return to the negotiating table to harvest the provisions that work, jettison those that don't, and ultimately keep China out of the deal. To conclude, we need a trade strategy for the Indo-Pacific that works for Americans and works for democracy, one that serves both our economic and commercial interests as well as our strategic ones. Above all, we need to be bold and we need to act swiftly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Mr. Wessel. He's out in cyberspace, I believe, somewhere.
There, I am, and unmuting.
Very good.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Crapo, members of the committee, it's an honor to be here before you today. My name is Michael Wessel, and I am here on behalf of Organized Labor as the staff chair of the Labor Advisory Committee for Trade Negotiations and Trade Policy. Labor appreciates the seat you are providing at the committee's table. As a disclaimer, however, my comments are my own. Some are posturing that we need to advance the IPEF as a way of being engaged in the region. We already are engaged. We have free trade agreements with 3 countries and a separate trade agreement with Japan. We have hundreds of billions of trade with the region. Last year, we had a trade deficit of $33 billion with India, more than $60 billion with Japan, and $90 billion with Vietnam. We have more than $1 trillion in foreign direct investment in the Indo-Pacific. So the real question isn't whether we should be engaged, but what the future architecture of that economic engagement should be. Workers want to know what the impact of the IPEF will be on them and their families. They deserve a better idea of how the IPEF will advance rather than undermine their economic interests. Let me focus quickly on 3 issues: workers' rights and corporate accountability, digital trade, and resilient supply chains. The number one concern for organized labor is how workers' rights will be protected, enforced, and promoted in the region. Workers' rights are key to ensuring that trade will promote growth and opportunity for workers rather than driving a race to the bottom. Administration officials have indicated that workers' rights will be part of the IPEF, but how broad that coverage is, what standards will be applied, and what enforcement mechanisms will be included is an open question. These coupled with enforceable corporate accountability measures, and they must cut across all of the separate modules of the IPEF. For digital trade, these are highly complex issues and require enormous study and evaluation. Rushing to adopt new digital trade measures could have serious adverse consequences for U.S. economic and national security interests. Congress must be broadly engaged, along with other stakeholders, in assessing what the road ahead should look like. Digital trade is a worker issue. More and more jobs are susceptible to outsourcing over digital platforms. Digital platforms are being used to surveil workers, are vehicles for misclassification, and are jeopardizing their privacy and security. Creative artists see their very livelihood under attack, and their livelihoods depend even more on strong safeguards. One website in the Philippines advertised that it provides healthcare business services for savings of up to 75% over what a U.S. employer would have to pay. Yes, that's already happening. But a digital trade agreement can accelerate that offshoring, or with proper enforceable workers' rights, corporate accountability, and other measures, it can help rebalance the playing field. Digital trade cannot be the only component of the IPEF and should not be part of an early harvest strategy. Digital trade is a real focus of organized labor. Supply chains are no longer just discussed in boardrooms, but at kitchen tables as well. Our citizens have had to confront where to get COVID tests, PPE, toilet paper, and other goods. Auto workers wonder where the semiconductors will come from so that they can return to their jobs. Other assembly lines have been slowed or idled by other supply chain bottlenecks. What will a resilient supply chain module in the IPEF mean for them? For many workers, the best supply chain is one that is here in America. We know that we live in a global marketplace and we buy and sell products around the world. Preferably, we'd sell more, a lot more. Resilient supply chains must be about more than simply shifting supplies from China to other countries in the Indo-Pac. Only limited benefits and will continue our reliance and dependence on others for our products. Any approach on supply chains must support the efforts of this and the last president to address our critical needs. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Crapo, organized labor supports international engagement and strengthening our relations around the globe. Engaging in the world is an imperative. Foreign policy, however, has been more of a driver of trade agreements than the economic results they produce. The public rejects that approach. A properly designed IPEF, along with other provisions in the broader Indo-Pacific strategy, can truly be a force for progress. That must be our goal. We look forward to working with the committee and the Congress in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wessel, and we've appreciated all your assistance. Also, for people who are paying attention to this discussion right now, and they're being introduced to some new acronyms, some new lingo in the foreign policy and trade area. Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is what we're talking about when you hear senators talk about the IPEF. Okay, let's go now to you, Ms. Lonzo, because China keeps building the Great Firewall higher and higher and higher each year. And in doing so, they suppress political dissent. It is really a human rights disaster. And it's no coincidence that the same laws that crush free speech in China also prevent American companies from competing fairly in the largest country on earth. And I think what's ominous is this repressive model is starting to spread like dominoes throughout the Indo-Pacific region. So we obviously want to push back against censorship in China and elsewhere. And we also want to begin to flesh out the trade rules of the road as it relates to the digital sector. The internet is the shipping lane of the 21st century, as we've come to define it here in this committee. So my first question to you, Ms. Lonzo, is we want to get other countries, particularly ones that might be interested in joining this Indo-Pacific economic framework, perhaps India, Vietnam, and others, to join with us, because if we have a bigger coalition, the stronger we are in pressing back against China's censorship. How do we go about doing that?
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you very much for the question, Senator Wyden. I think it's going to involve a mix of various strategies. I think one of the most important things to do when looking in the Indo-Pacific region is to understand what are some of the motivations behind some of the more concerning tactics that we have seen or concerning elements of the legal frameworks. For example, in my testimony, I talk a lot about this issue of personnel localization or local presence rules. These are kind of proliferating across the region for various reasons. By requiring local presence in a country, it gives that nation jurisdiction over a U.S. tech company. That can be abused in certain ways, and we've certainly seen it be abused in China, for example, to threaten to jail or fine staff and fine employees who are in country in order to make a company comply with censorship demands or providing access to user data. But there are also reasons, for example, legitimate law enforcement needs to access user data, or concerns about the security and privacy of user data if U.S. tech companies are not kind of bound by the laws in a particular country. So that's where I think the United States could really kind of look at addressing those underlying impacts, including through whatever updates are needed to the laws in the United States, which I do hope includes passing federal privacy legislation and updating, reforming U.S. surveillance laws. Being able to kind of come to the table willing to talk about addressing those core needs will also give room to the U.S. to set some really clear, bright lines around human rights and the rule of law in the region, to reject issues like internet shutdowns or general monitoring and filtering obligations in the country, to push for limits to surveillance laws.
I know we're going to call on you frequently in this area because particularly your work focusing on the intersection of human rights and technology is especially important right now. I recently got asked by the press what the importance of encryption is, because I kept talking about it in the context of Ukraine and Russia. And I said, let me be real blunt about this. Encryption there is literally a matter of life and death. It's just that simple. If you don't protect people's data with strong encryption, you can have people lose their lives. So thank you for your good work. Question for you, Mr. Wessel, as I wrap up my first round. What do you think the lessons are, Mr. Wessel, as it relates to what we learned with the Usmca, U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, as it related to protecting workers? And we want to make sure that workers are protected on both sides of the ocean. We want to make sure that we use the innovative steps that we have recently put together with respect to worker protection and see if there's some lessons learned for going forward in the Indo-Pacific region. You were instrumental in working with us on what came to be known. I'm proud to be associated with Senator Brown on this, the Brown-Wyden Rapid Response Mechanism to respond to labor violations at the facility level in Mexico. What are the lessons from Usmca that we can employ to protect workers both in the Indo-Pacific region and our workers who are counting on those good-paying jobs?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for your leadership along with Senator Brown and others in bringing us the rapid response mechanism. It was an innovative and groundbreaking approach in terms of labor rights enforcement, coupled with what the USMCA had as part of its definition of what the rights should be to be enforced. It ensured for the first time facility level enforcement mechanisms, replacing essentially state to state, so that we knew that the bad actors would pay the price for any abuses of labor rights. There's been an evolution, as you know, of labor rights over the 40 years, the last 40 years, from simple unilateral approaches to enforce your own laws to new standards. USMCA was groundbreaking in terms of its labor chapter. We need to include a similar concept in any IPEF that defines the rights and couple it with an enforcement mechanism that is accessible, timely, and as possible, facility specific.
Thank you again for your innovative thinking on this, and we'll be working with you, I know. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Lonzo, I'm not going to ask you a question because Senator Wyden really covered the issue. I just want to highlight that the points you raise show how critical it is that we deal with our digital policy globally in an effective way. This is not just an issue of freedom and human rights. It's an issue of economics and trade and, frankly, national security. So I just want to highlight that I agree with your testimony. I want to go first to Ms. Lauritsen. You already answered this question, but I want to ask it again and ask you to just briefly restate your position here because it's so important. I'm glad that the administration's proposed IPEF may include what it describes as binding rules, particularly if they extend to digital trade and agriculture market access and so forth. But to ensure that our free trade agreement rules are binding because we can enforce them through dispute settlement provisions is key, in my opinion. Are binding rules possible if an IPEF, if it lacks a dispute resolution mechanism?
I guess I would suggest in response, Senator, that there are different types of dispute resolution mechanisms. Clearly having something that's binding, such as what Congress has already approved in USMCA, is very helpful. But other mechanisms can also be through mediation or actually forcing your trade and your agriculture officials to sit down and hash out how to fix particular problems. But clearly having a binding agreement is critical in the end if all else fails.
Yeah, I agree with you because we can force them to hash it out, which they do very well and very long, and they never get to a resolution sometimes. Ms. Shaw, could I ask you quickly to answer the same question because I've got another question for you.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you, Senator. You need a stick. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to organize an enforceable mechanism, but at the end of the day, you need a stick. And traditionally, we've done that through the threat of removing preferential market access or tariffs. It's difficult to see, absent that, what could really enforce the agreement, but it's important not only to ensure that other countries abide by the rules that they negotiated, but also to incentivize investment by private sector to make sure that they have sufficient certainty that those rules will remain in place.
All right, thank you very much. And Ms. Shaw, your expertise is quite unique. You were a former negotiator at the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, also a key Trump administration official with responsibility for managing the U.S. economic relationship with China. And TPP is now claimed to be outdated with respect to China because it was negotiated during the Obama administration so long ago. Every witness, as I understood your testimony, agreed that we've got to get engaged. We've got to get off the sidelines and back in the game. but it's not clear that there's agreement among the witnesses as to what that engagement should look like. We have the IPEF, which we've heard some discussion about, that appears to be the current approach that the administration is pursuing. We have the TPP, or maybe it's now the CPTPP. It's kind of unclear whether that's one or two different things. But I was always discouraged that we stepped off to the sidelines and did not get back re-engaged. And my question to you is, given that we need to be engaged and get off the sidelines, what is the vehicle? What do we need to do?
Thank you for the question. If IPEF is a modest step forward, joining CPTPP would be a giant leap, but that still doesn't get us all the way. There's a lot of work to be done. First and foremost, we need strong, enforceable commitments on trade. We are losing with respect to market access and China, the European Union, and other countries that are out there negotiating the rules without us. CPTPP, it's a flawed agreement. There is a reason why we didn't have the votes in Congress. There is a reason why both major presidential candidates came out against it. But that said, it's fixable. There was a lot, as I noted in my opening remarks, there were a lot of provisions that were groundbreaking, specifically for the region. Provisions on telecommunications, on services, and at the time, provisions on labor and the environment as well. But we can go further. And negotiating strong provisions on SOEs, labor, environment, going further, and agriculture and market access are things that we can do because our CPT partners would be open to doing it. But I think we need to do so, and we need to do so quickly before the opportunity closes.
Well, thank you. I appreciate and I agree with your answer. As I noted in my introductory remarks, China is seeking to join. They see it, even though they just got their agreement agreed to in January, their broader agreement agreed to in January. They understand where the game is and are getting engaged. I think the United States needs to do the same.
Thank you, Senator Crapo, and I know we're going to be working together on these issues. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, and I thank Senator Crapo. And if anything, I see a Northwest delegation here who should know and does know how important trade is. And I definitely think we think about it a little differently maybe than some parts of the world. I get so challenged sometimes talking about it. I just say, you just need to know that we were trading with China before Lewis and Clark showed up. So that means we're going to want to continue to open market access. And when you think about the Northwest economy, whether it's apples or airplanes or software, more than 50% of each of those markets are, international trade, or I should say wheat is 90%. Okay, so my question is, I agreed with a lot that you said, Ms. Shaw, because, this dissecting trade as an avenue against authoritarianism is something I care immensely about. It took a 20-year-old staffer on my team to just say trade changes culture. I'm like, yes, of course, but I think people somehow have forgotten that trade changes culture, and that part of what we're trying to do is open up and have more stable democracies around the world, and that's why we engage in trade. So I agree with you that we need to use our leadership. If you're not there, I remember a trip to Egypt after the change in the riots that took place, and we said to the embassy, let's go talk about wheat, because this was all about the price of bread. And they said, oh, no, let's not. I said, what do you mean? Oh, well, we've already lost too much market share to the Canadians. They don't want to hear from us. So losing market share is an irreplaceable problem. And if you're not at the table, you're not in the current negotiations. Lose market share is not just losing imports, or our exports. It's losing ultimately in the competitive game. So my one thing is that, I know your past role in the administration, which I definitely would characterize the Trump administration as a tariff-first approach, and I felt very challenged by that, given the impacts that we saw. We had apples face a 70% tariff. India used to be the second largest export for Washington apples before the Trump administration's trade war, and now it is a huge decrease from last year. What should the U.S. be doing to end retaliatory tariffs in India and elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, thank you so much for the question, Senator. And I should say I'm born and raised in the great state of Washington, so I think that you will find my views on trade are quite similar to yours, just given the importance that I saw growing up. The first step is to be engaged. It is difficult to extract meaningful concessions from our trading partners unless we are at the table talking to them about these issues. And unfortunately, there was retaliation imposed as a result of some of the trade actions that we took. But at this point in time, we need to talk about how we can advance our mutual interests. So I would just encourage the administration to be as bold as possible, and Congress in your role to be instructing them in the way that we need to move forward on these issues. But certainly we have a number of challenges related to India, but it is the world's largest democracy and a partner that we want to work with strategically in the region. So we're just going to have to roll up our sleeves and figure it out.
Do you think that we should get rid of these retaliatory tariffs?
In terms of India's tariffs on us, or
The fact that this listen, I think what you learn when you grow up in the Northwest is you start this fight, it's going to have consequences. And so you're a dispute. We're in disputes on the solar stuff. And it's 10 years later, and nothing has happened. So we've basically slowed everything down. So I do agree with your viewpoint, which is, if you want to define the debate, you've got to be in the debate. And I personally believe we should be defining this debate all over the place. If you're in the debate, you can say this is what countries need to do on the digital side. This is what you need to do if you want to adhere to democracies. This is what you want to do if you want to adhere to improving and enforcing, as we did with Mexico, building capacity so you actually have enforcement of the laws, not just the agreements, but actual enforcement. So I just think right now that we have to end this retaliatory tariff issue is costing us, and to say nothing of the supply chain problems that we have. So farmers are really taking it right squarely on the nose, and we need to help.
No, I certainly agree with that. Our struggles with India are longstanding and deep. They have a lot of challenges in terms of the waterfront of trade issues, but we're going to have to figure out a way to use the leverage we have to get them to peel back some of the barriers to trade that they do impose against us. But I agree with you. I think they're a strategic partner, and I think we need to be at the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well said, as always, Senator Cantwell. Our next three are Senator Grassley, Senator Menendez, and Senator Cornyn. Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing some trade issues to this committee, because it's not being discussed much in this town at all, and I'm disappointed in that. So I'm going to start with Ms. Lorenzen. The Indo-Pacific strategy mentions several ways to improve trade in this region, yet agriculture was not mentioned once. I have serious concern. I better put this on quiet. I have serious concerns about U.S. agriculture producers being left behind in this economic framework. We also see this administration falling behind on confirming nominees to key trading posts. USTR still doesn't have a chief agriculture negotiator, and USDA does not have undersecretary for trade and foreign affairs. Considering your experience at both USDA and USTR, can you tell me what the administration is losing by not having Senate-confirmed leaderships in these positions?
Well, thank you, Senator, and I agree with your sentiments. I was a civil service heading up the agriculture office at USTR, and I can assure you that having your political and Senate-confirmed bosses in place is important in order to have agriculture be part of the discussion among the political and the White House engagement. So I think it's extremely important. It's important also to be able to engage with other countries, because many agriculture issues are going to be political. So you need a political person there to push, to drive, to lead, and to have the vision to move forward. And this is one of those areas in IPEF where making sure you have a strong agriculture voice at the political level within the administration will be important to make sure it gets included as a part of any negotiation.
Also for you, one of my top concerns is seeing China take serious action to expand its foothold in the Indo-Pacific region. You note in your testimony that other countries are not standing still, and it is U.S. farmers who are losing market share. Do you feel that the Indo-Pacific economic framework is the best vehicle for increasing our engagement in the Indo-Pacific region?
Thank you, Senator. Well, in full disclosure, I was one of the negotiators of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I feel that that agreement and the CPTPP would be particularly important and possibly easier to benefit American farmers and ranchers. I recognize there are a whole bunch of other issues that make it difficult, but that might be an important vehicle that might be able to be achieved more quickly if there were the political will on the part of the United States. Absent that, and absent any other bilateral trade agreement negotiations, IPEF could be an important vehicle provided it's got the right provisions, the right level of ambition to actually open up export markets for American food and agricultural products.
And also for you, a few weeks ago, Ambassador Tai made comment about setting standards that promote fair and open competition with respect to our ag producers when developing the Indo-Pacific framework. I appreciate those comments, but we need more concrete clarification about how the administration is working to involve the agricultural industry in the process. So for you, what would your advice be to Ambassador Tai regarding non-tariff trade barriers like burdensome regulatory requirements and geographical indication barriers to the sale of U.S. exports?
So I'm a firm believer, Senator, in a two-prong approach. One is building the strong rules. Usmca has a set of very strong rules when it comes to sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. But the other is actually to get the regulators and the trade negotiators at the table with the political will to find the resolution and open up those markets. They need to be handled in tandem to have real results for our exporters.
My next question is the last one. The government of India has a goal of 20% ethanol blending in gasoline by 2025. E20 is set to be rolled out starting April 2023. This is an aggressive timeline for a country with over 1 billion people. As noted in your testimony, India currently restricts ethanol imports. How can the United States best engage with India so that they can meet their air quality and climate goals through U.S.-produced ethanol?
Thank you, Senator. And that's actually an issue that I worked on while I was at the U.S. Trade Representative's office and engaged proactively with India. And we were actually making progress, but then the pandemic occurred and change of administration, so things slowed down. So I do think there's an opportunity, again, if you're at the table and actively negotiating and engaging, to be able to open up that India market, particularly for ethanol for fuel use.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Even as the United States is currently focused on the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine, it is clear that one of the most pressing challenges facing the United States in the 21st century remains what has rightly been termed strategic competition with China. And while we may still have aspirations for a more constructive future with China, I think we have to be clear-eyed and focused as we contemplate the sort of regional and global architecture inimical to our interests and our values that Beijing is currently seeking to construct, and the steps that we have to take to invest in our economy and to safeguard our interests and values and those of our allies and partners. And I think we also must be equally clear-eyed that much of our strategic competition with China is not just in traditional geopolitical or geostrategic spheres, but competition in geoeconomic dimensions of national power, shaped by new and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and genomics, among others. So success in this new realm of competition will require the United States to work with like-minded partners to assure that the economic and commercial map of the Indo-Pacific is connected, free, and open, and that the United States is engaged. So the administration's IPEF proposal, to me, represents a good first step in that direction, but that's just it, I think, a first step. What should a robust and durable regional economic architecture, one that's underpinned by high quality, high standard agreements on labor, the environment, intellectual property, rule of law, look like? I met with all of the ASEAN ambassadors last week, and they all say this is nice, but we are really looking, if you want to have a real presence here, then we are looking for a more robust aspirational effort. So can you address that? It's an open question to any of you who wish to do so.
Senator, I'd be happy to take that question and appreciate all the work of you and your staff on so many issues. As I look at recent events in Ukraine with China's actions in Hong Kong, their coercive tactics and threats to Taiwan as well, I think we all can understand that many of the countries in the Indo-Pacific are not embracing China's vision of what their hegemonic control of the region should be. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaged. As I said earlier, we are engaged. The question is, moving forward, what are the standards and how do we engage? I think Usmca showed that with real discussions with labor and other stakeholders across the board, that goes to the fine details of any approach. We can work things out. Doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, but we can reach a broad consensus. So I'm optimistic. I don't believe that countries like Vietnam, India, et cetera, for all the reasons you know, are looking to China as being the leader. We are engaged. We must continue that engagement, and we must deepen it.
Ms. Shaw, did I see you leaning in to answer?
Yes, but happy if you have another question.
No.
On this, I could not agree more with your point, sir. The 10 ASEAN countries together comprise the 5th largest economy in the world, and China is their #1 trading partner. The RCEP agreement that we talked about earlier further entrenches a China-ASEAN supply chain, and we don't seem to be doing much about it. I agree with you that IPEF is a modest first step, but the question is, what else are we going to do? I would put forward the CPTPP as the obvious next step, but that's not going to get us all the way. We need strong rules that are comprehensive, that cover the waterfront of our trade and economic relationship, and we need to offer an alternative to China, not just in terms of markets, but in values. And having real rules where we have skin in the game, that's what's really going to move the needle, and that's what's really going to get countries interested in this IPEF exercise.
600 million people and 5th largest economy in the world. Seems to me that we should do it much better. Lastly, Taiwan is a key trading partner of the United States, one with which we have a strategic relationship that is intimately intertwined with our economic security, particularly as it relates to trade in semiconductors. Could you comment on the role Taiwan plays in regional trade and economic relations, and wouldn't excluding Taiwan represent a missed opportunity both for the vision we have for Taiwan and also for the sort of regional trade and economic architecture we're seeking to build? I didn't think my questions were that difficult. Anybody want to answer that? Shall I direct my question then so that I can get an answer? Ms. Lawrenson, I see you're smiling, so I'm going to give you the shot.
Right, well, that's a huge foreign policy issue, so I wanted to keep my lane in the food and agriculture. You know, Taiwan's a very important export market for U.S. food and agricultural goods. But obviously, there's huge foreign policy issues that are, I'll say, well above my pay grade, even when I worked for the government, that needs to be delicately balanced.
But even if we set aside the foreign policy elements as a regional trading element, it is a powerhouse in that regard, isn't it not, Ms. Shaw?
You know, we have managed to figure out a trading relationship with Taiwan in the context of the World Trade Organization. I think that there are ways to move forward that don't necessarily beg the question of the relationship that we want to have with China. Taiwan is clearly a red line for China, so I agree with my fellow witness at the witness table that we need to take into consideration broader issues if we are going to move forward in deepening trade relationships with Taiwan. But I agree, they're strategically an important partner and economically, and I think we can figure out a way forward in the context of this broader IPEF exercise.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank my colleague. It's good to have the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who looks at these issues. And I thought that last comment to Chairman Menendez was very instructive. We've got to find a way that works in both countries. And I'm one who's committed to doing that and working with my friend to do it. Okay. Let's see. Our next senator will be Senator Cardin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important topic, and I appreciate the witnesses joining us today. I'm glad to see the Biden administration taking some first positive steps toward trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, but looking back on TPP, Senator Carper, who's the chairman of the Trade Subcommittee, and I, as the ranking member, have written and spoken a number of times, had a hearing on the importance of re-engaging in the region and expressing some regret that we did not take the issue more seriously when TPP was on the table. I think that was a missed opportunity for us, and here we are today. Having Trade Promotion Authority expired, it seems to me that that would be a first logical step for Congress to take if we're actually serious about trade in the Indo-Pacific. One of the challenges with the economic framework that's been announced by the administration is, of course, it depends on who's president, and will change perhaps as the politics change and with each change of the executive. And so it seems to me that trying to figure out how we can move toward a more permanent or more stable relationship by re-engaging with the prospect of a possible trade agreement would be very, very important. And I appreciate the comments made by Senator Menendez. I don't know how we can look at this issue through a soda straw and just look at the economic aspects of it and not consider the national security imperative that's involved. China is at the top of everybody's list here in Washington, D.C., as it should be, and something we are playing catch-up on. But, Ms. Shaw, would you just comment on the desirability of us actually passing Trade Promotion Authority as a prerequisite to re-engaging with the possibility of another trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, clearly, to be effective in the region, we are going to need to negotiate the types of commitments that require congressional authority. So for that reason alone, I think it's certainly a step in the right direction, and it's a positive sign to our trading partners that we're serious about this type of engagement. I guess my question would be, if you were to give the administration trade promotion authority, is it something at this point they'd be willing to use? And I'm not sure the answer to that is yes.
No. Well, I know that one of the issues that continues to come up, and the chairman raised it as well, he and Senator Brown championed some labor-related provisions in the Usmca. And Mr. Wessel, I might ask you, as the chair of the Labor Advisory Committee to USTR, last year at a hearing on the Usmca, I asked a labor representative what it would take for labor to get behind a multilateral regional comprehensive trade agreement in the Asia Pacific. And the response was, we are a long way from there. Could you provide maybe some more detail for what it would take to get labor on board?
I'd be happy to, and thank you for your question. In my prepared testimony, I identify a number of provisions in the TPP that labor thought were deficient, from a rule of origin that would have allowed China, for example, to provide 2/3 of the products in an auto assembled by other countries in the TPP region, and have that considered for preferential status, to the SOE provisions, where labor and the business community jointly in the ACPIN report indicated that the provisions were deficient by grandfathering all subsidies prior to entry into force, as well as having an injury test that in most situations required injury to occur for a year or more. for many industries, agriculture, commodities, steel, etc. Contracts are often done on spot basis, so the injury is periodic and not continuous. And the result was the ability to fight SOEs under that provision would have been very limited. In the labor area, not only were the rights deficient, the consistency plans were inadequate. In Vietnam, it would have allowed them to have a 5 cent an hour minimum wage, but qualified as they had a minimum wage. So the substantive concerns that labor had about the TPP were very deep. It was not a question of whether we should be engaged or whether we should have a trade agreement, but what its provision.
Thank you. My time's up.
Thank my colleague. Our next four will be Senator Carper, Senator Portman, Senator Cardin, and Senator Cassidy. And I believe Senator Carper is on the line.
He is proudly on the line.
Wonderful.
Mr. Chairman, you're a fellow who's played a lot of basketball in his day, and the University of Delaware's actually we have some of our women's sports teams that are quite good over the years, and we've had some great football teams and basketball teams as well. But it's the first time in Delaware history when both our men's and our women's basketball team made it to the NCAA. So we have a witness, and I think it's Ms. Lonzo. Ms. Lonzo, are you a Fighting Blue Hen?
I am. Let's go Blue Hens.
All right. Friday, I think afternoon, the boys' men's team goes to Pittsburgh, play Villanova. That's will be a real challenge. And I think we're taking on Maryland at College Park on Friday afternoon as well. So we'll see how it ends up. We're just proud to make it this far. I want to welcome all of our witnesses, those who are Blue Hens, those who aspire to be Fighting Blue Hens. But three topics I'd like to cover today. One is, and I probably won't have time for all of them, but effective tools for economic engagement with our allies would be one, digital trade in the Indo-Pacific, and a third is achieving environmental goals through trade. We'll start with the get my place here. Let's start with the effective tools for economic engagement with our allies, and this would be I think from Ms. Shaw. First, we're grateful for all of your presence with us today. I've long advocated for multilateral economic cooperation, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm proud that today's hearing builds on the bipartisan work that Senator Cardin was just spoken, and I have done as leaders of the Trade Subcommittee of this committee, including holding a hearing last summer on opportunities for engagement in the Indo-Pacific. This framework also provides an opportunity to work cooperatively with many of our like-minded allies in order to advance our shared values and combat the rise of China. However, this framework is not expected to include tariff reduction or expanded market access, which typically serve as incentives for greater cooperation during multilateral negotiations. My question for you, Ms. Shaw, is this. Absent increased market access, what tools should U.S. policymakers consider to incentivize our partners to join this effort and adopt robust standards as part of the Indo-Pacific economic framework?
Well, thank you so much for the question. I think you'll find my answer is pretty straightforward. It's that we need market access to be on the table in order to incentivize our trading partners to make substantive commitments in these areas. It is hard to imagine what incentive they would have unless there is some more skin in the game. So I think as a first step, Congress should really impress upon the administration to expand their scope and to the extent they're not considering market access, to reevaluate that strategy.
Well, that was pretty straightforward. Thank you. My second question would go to Ms. Lonzo and Mr. Wessel and deals again with digital trade in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific economic framework presents an important opportunity to establish a digital trade rule that uplift workers and expand economic opportunity for women, for people of color, and individuals from lower income backgrounds, as well as the rest of us. And I'm eager to work with the Biden administration and our allies to advance policies that support the free flow of data, connect small businesses to global markets, and ensure that digital technologies abide by robust cybersecurity and consumer protection standards. Questions again for Ms. Lonzo and Mr. Wessel. What lesson can we take from digital trade standards and existing multilateral agreements such as Usmca and the U.S.-Japan agreement, and what kind of digital rules would best support U.S. workers and businesses? Ms. Lonzo, please.
Yes, thank you, Senator. We absolutely need to be pursuing commitments from nations in the region to limit the use of surveillance technologies, both through domestic legislation protecting, for example, workers' rights, ensuring that workers are not surveilled by bossware or other kinds of monitoring technologies, but also to focus on the limit on export controls and to ensure that spyware and other privacy-invasive technologies are not able to be kind of exported and shared around the world.
All right, thank you. Mr. Wessel, same question, Mr. Wessel.
Very broad question, and clearly a digital component of the IPEF can have benefits for workers, for democracy and many other interests, but it also can undermine them. When we look, for example, at Section 512, you mentioned previous trade agreements. As the Patent Office, I believe, said, Copyright Office, it's unbalanced and is in need of being updated, and the Senate Judiciary Committee is looking at that. When we look at the rights of creative artists, of which there is now $2 billion of their income that's at risk every year, we need to make sure that we have the enforcement mechanisms that ensure that there's not wage theft. But there are many other provisions, and it was mentioned by the chairman earlier about the Arab Spring and the power of the internet to help spread democracy. It can also be used for ill purposes, as we've seen with surveillance, with the Great Firewall, etc. So this is a deep issue that we look forward to working with you and your colleagues about to find the right balance to move forward.
All right, thanks, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. If you don't mind, I'd just like to take 15 seconds to just state my third question for the record. And that question is, what opportunities exist to promote environmental conservation and sustainability as we engage with our allies in the Indo-Pacific region? And that would be a question for the record. Again, thank you all very much for joining us today. And I'll say, Ms. Lonzo, in closing, go blue. Thank you.
Senator Carper, I should also point out that 2 of my sons are blue hens, so it's in the family.
Oh, that's great. They must have picked the right father and mother.
Thank you, Senator Carper. As a general proposition, anybody who gets me involved in a basketball discussion is going to generate a lot of time, so we'll have to pass on that today. Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank you and Senator Crapo for holding this hearing. It's really important, and I want to start by just 3 quick thoughts about where we are in terms of Indo-Pacific trade. One is we have to recognize the importance of opening up foreign markets. That's sort of an obvious advantage of trade. Trade jobs pay about 16% more on average. 90% of consumers live outside of the United States. We need to make things in this country in order to take advantage of that, but that should be the objective. Second, I find it surprising that after passing Usmca with such an overwhelming bipartisan vote, the conclusion of a lot of people is that we should stop expanding trade at all. You know, if you look at the campaign that President Biden ran, one thing they said was, let's stop FTAs. That has always been very confusing to me. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as was said earlier, does not include any new market access for U.S. exporters. I mean, I don't get that. Senator Carper just talked about that. It disappoints me because after decades and decades of debate, we finally developed what I thought was a pretty good paradigm that found consensus between industry, labor, ag, and others, and it's a template that we, should be using to move forward and improve our competitiveness. Instead, we're ceding market share to China. And Mr. Wessel acknowledged this in his testimony. We need to be engaged in the region, not just writing it off, and engaged in terms of opening up new market access. Third, when we talk about expanding trade, there's always a tendency to default to TPP. So it's either you're for trade promotion, you're for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or nothing. And we have to remember that that wasn't very popular on a bipartisan basis. It had some flaws, including its impact on the manufacturing sector here in this country. I think what we should be doing immediately is getting Japan into the fold. Japan is by far the largest economy in the TPP group that we do not already have a trade agreement with. We have trade agreements with most of them, but not Japan. So we ought to deepen the existing ties with Japan and get a trade agreement done, which requires TPA, which is another reason
it's important that we sort of look beyond this notion that somehow trade is not a good thing, but rather it's something that helps our American workers. Lastly, we need to be blunt about the elephant in the room, which is China. In 2002, America was the top trading partner of these Indo-Pacific nations. We were number one. Today, it's China, by far. And Ms. Shaw, I heard your comment on that, but they are the most dominant trading partner, and that should be a wake-up call to us to embrace a new path forward, one that allows us, again, to have better market access to our products, and like Usmca, has enforceable labor and environmental rules to guard against offshoring. There are a couple of things that some of us have proposed, and I want to ask you about quickly that takes us down that track. One is to do something with regard to the WTO. Right now, too often agreements get stalled because one country or another objects. Often it's China. And so it works by consensus, and that means it doesn't work very well. Senator Coons and I have introduced legislation called the Trading System Preservation Act, which gives authority to USTR to pursue sector-specific trade agreements with allies which do not have an MFN or a most favored nation requirement. In other words, we should find like-minded countries that want to come up with an agreement with us and move forward with those agreements. And we should not certainly allow China to be able to free ride on the global trading system or be empowered to act as a spoiler to prevent these agreements from going forward. The government procurement agreement at the WTO would be an example of that. So let me start with you, Ms. Shaw. Do you support sector-specific plurilateral agreements without MFN that are an effective way to open markets with allies and to put pressure on China?
Thank you for the question. I do. And thank you for your leadership, along with Senator Coons, on that piece of legislation. I think countries are going to continue to negotiate with or without the WTO. So to make clear that the view from the U.S. Congress is that we should be pursuing plurilateral agreements is the right message to be sending to Geneva and our trading partners around the world. But what I would say about plurilateral and sector-specific agreements is that we shouldn't be limiting ourselves to a single sector or a single topic to discuss. We should be negotiating across a broad range of plurilaterals so that we have the opportunity to make important trades across difficult issue areas. That's how we make progress. And I realize I'm talking to a former USTR about negotiations, so definitely defer to your experience. But I don't see how we can make significant progress just taking one issue at a time. I think we need to take a coalition of the willing and go deep on a certain set of issues that really reflect the challenges we're facing today.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation because there are trade-offs between different sectors, and our legislation wouldn't be limited just to one specific sector, but it would be this notion that we don't have to have everybody on board because that's what's blocked progress in all kinds of things. Think of environmental goods. I mean, why can't we come to put an agreement on that? Because, one, or in that case, I think two countries object. Well, let's get the rest of us together and maybe do some trade-offs with some other areas and move forward to expand opportunities for trade and market openings. The other bill that we've been working on is called Level the Playing Field 2.0, and a number of members of this committee are co-sponsors of that legislation. Senator Brown and I are the original co-sponsors. And basically what it says is the reality is with Belt and Road in particular and with transshipments that China continues to game the international trading system, and we need to be responsive to that. That's the real world. So that legislation has new tools to combat some of these trade abuses. We now have 172 business trade associations and ag groups and unions that have endorsed the bill. It has a lot of support here on both sides of the aisle, including with Republicans, and it also passed the House as part of the Competes Act. Mr. Wessel, maybe you could comment on that legislation. Do you agree that Level the Playing Field Act 2.0 will help combat China's unfair trade practices and improve our economic situation in the Indo-Pacific area?
Couldn't speak more highly of both the bill that you and Senator Brown put together and your work over time, but the importance of Level the Playing Field 2.0 is a component of whatever legislation comes out of the conference on competes in Usmca. Giving workers the tools to defend their rights when they're injured by unfair foreign trade is vital. There are too many areas right now where they have no tools and they are victims. Your legislation will help put an end to that.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time.
Very good. We're next with Senator Cardin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank all of our witnesses. It's very helpful to have a former USTR on our committee, so And I really do want to acknowledge Senator Portman's has always reached out to try to find bipartisan ways to advance all agendas, including in trade. So we appreciate your willingness to try to find common areas so we can advance trade in this country. Thank you. I want to start with an observation and then ask Mr. Wetzel what we can expect in regards to this framework to advance good governance. In the last Trade Promotional Authority, we put as one of the principal objectives good governance, anti-corruption. And the USTR took that seriously in the initial negotiations on the TPP, because as that was evolving, there was a strong chapter on anti-corruption and governance. Now, we're not a party to the TPP, but some of the countries that are part of this framework discussions. So, Mr. Wetzel, I would like to get from you, recognizing this is a framework, it's not dealing with market access, what can we reasonably expect to be able to achieve to advance our good governance, anti-corruption agenda that Congress has clearly shown a direct interest in any trade discussions? What can we expect in this framework?
I'm optimistic about what we can achieve. If you look at some of the other components of the overall Indo-Pacific strategy, which includes infrastructure, decarbonization, and many other components, good governance, anti-corruption is a real opportunity for making some advances. We've all seen the China model as it relates to Belt and Road, debt faults and their approaches there, etc. The public in many of these countries is desperate for anti-corruption measures. And with many of the provisions, the carrots that are in what President Biden is seeking to achieve, anti-corruption provisions should be part of that.
So without having a formal access agreement, how do you enforce any of those understandings in the framework? Could you just enlighten me how we could advance these issues but have some degree of confidence that it's not just language, not just verbal commitments, but actually we have made progress in being able to achieve these objectives?
And when one looks at what the administration is talking about in terms of infrastructure, alternatives to the AIIB, and other engagement in the region, I think there are real incentives to have enforceable standards around good governance, anti-corruption. There will be other provisions, of course, where there are carrots, some sticks, maybe sharp carrots, as I like to say. And I think there are ways of ensuring that there are enforcement measures, because there will be preferential approaches within the overall Indo-Pacific strategy.
Thank you. Shaw, I want to get to a separate subject. The Usmca included a separate chapter on small business, which was very much appreciated by the small business community. I chaired a small business committee, and I've been pushing for similar sensitivities as we go into all trade discussions. So in regards to this framework, could you just give us a strategy as to how we can be sensitive to the needs of smaller companies?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, small and medium-sized enterprises face unique challenges, and it's important that we take steps to increase their opportunities in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as safeguard their interests in the project. You know, one way that we can address some of these issues is through trade facilitation, easing some of the custom burden, cutting red tape, making it easier for our businesses that need critical inputs to be able to get them and to be able to get them quickly. But I think that just generally improving the terms of trade and, again, being as bold as possible and expanding the type of economic opportunities in the Indo-Pacific is going to go a long way to unleashing growth and opening up jobs and opportunities for some of our small and medium-sized companies.
There's no question innovation is so much focused on the smaller companies, and there can be intimidation issues. So I think some of the areas that you're talking about are very, very important. We also saw that size of transactions may also be a factor that we can make special rules that will assist those smaller and middle-sized companies in not having to deal with some of the challenges that are created under trade agreements. So I thank you for that. I hope that we'll all stay engaged as this moves forward. It's an area that we're a little bit confused about because we don't know exactly what rules are going to be applied in regards to congressional engagement or private sector engagement. But I think it's important that we all stay involved because we know that we have to increase our presence in the Indo-Pacific area. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. We're now at Senator Cassidy.
Hey, thank you. I'll address my first question to Ms. Shaw and Mr. Wessel. So we put these negotiations in which we seek to have a decarbonization of an economy, and we seek to have some sort of labor standard so that our folks are not competing against slave labor. That's good. But the cost of compliance, or the cost of not using slave labor, increased your costs relative to a product made in China, for example. I spoke to one fellow, a company I was formerly with, made the decision to put their new plant, manufacturing plant in China because they didn't enforce their SOx and NOx scrubbers. The return on investment would be 18% there as opposed to 8% elsewhere, where they would have to turn on SOx and NOx scrubbers. In a sense, these requirements incentivize the movement of industry to China where they don't enforce these standards. So my point is, how do we avoid a race to bottom, or should there be some sort of offset, border offset for using slave labor, or for polluting the common areas of the ocean and of the sky with that which elsewhere we're attempting to regulate down? Put differently, if we negotiate a trade agreement of which China is not part of, and which the participants must have the cost of compliance with labor and environmental regulations, or are we not just building in an advantage for China? Ms. Shaw, you first, please.
Sure. You know, having diverse and resilient supply chains is critical. I mean, part of the challenges that you're talking about are that where it's cheaper to produce, that's where companies will go. But that's not the most effective way to do business. We have to incentivize companies to do business in a strong and resilient Indo-Pacific region where we do have high labor standards, we do have high environmental standards.
Because how do you incent it? Because there's a higher cost of doing business where you have those standards and a lower cost where you do not.
Market access. You get preferential trade treatment, lower duties if you meet certain standards and comply with certain provisions of the trade.
So implicit in what you just said is that there should be an elevated duty on those who do not meet some standard when it comes to the environment, labor, or perhaps other factors.
Or a lower duty for those that do.
Okay, and Mr. Wessel?
I think first of all, thank you for the question. I think in the terms of carbon intensity, there is a path forward. The U.S. and the EU, as part of their 232 arrangement, included a provision on a global arrangement to deal with carbon intensity as one component. And I think one of the things that's on the table there is a border adjustment measure that would address the lax environmental enforcement by China and other countries in terms of what they're exporting. For each ton of steel, as I understand it, China has 3 times more carbon intensity per ton than the U.S. We can't allow that to be a competitive advantage, and we need to deal with that with border measures. I expect as part of IPEF and the Indo-Pacific strategy that carbon intensity can be dealt with in a similar way. For the question of forced labor, similarly, we can have border measures. We do have some with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which is now going through the regulatory scrub. We've seen countries across the globe condemn China's actions in Xinjiang, calling them genocide. And we need to find a way to make sure that that is not a competitive advantage and is dealt with effectively among allied nations.
Would you suggest that if we are going to have a trade agreement with other countries in which we expect them to comply with standards such as this, that part of that trade agreement would have to have a border adjustment so that of some sort for these factors we're discussing to avoid that incentivization of companies to move to China?
I think in terms of carbon intensity, that's going to be on the table. In terms of forced labor, I think we need to trace supply chains to make sure that those products, either directly or, for example, polysilicon being utilized in solar arrays, et cetera, that those products do not make their way into the U.S. By doing that, we create the incentive for the Indo-Pac countries and others to disengage from Chinese supply chains that spoil the environment and abuse workers' rights.
I see. So wherever that supply chain flowed through, if you just wanted to take it through a third country, you would somehow defeat that initiative. Let me save a little bit of time.
Yes.
Ms. Lawrenson, may I ask you a quick question, please? I got a lot of shrimpers, and they're competing against what they allege is dumped shrimp coming from India. Now, I think your testimony points out that India has really high import tariffs, and yet we bless them with pretty low import tariffs on our side. If you will, it tilts the playing field. How do I go back to my shrimpers and defend that?
Right. Well, it's always a challenge, right? And India is a particularly protectionist market when it comes to food, seafood, and agricultural products. But this is where actually negotiating on tariffs and market access to level the playing field would be particularly important, either directly and bilaterally with India or through the IPEF. That's how you deal with it. Obviously, the U.S. already has countervailing duty and anti-dumping laws, which can help on the import side. But again, I would promote that having that balanced playing field in both markets can be of benefit.
I yield. Thank you.
I thank my colleague. Senator Hassan's next, and she has been very patient indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Crapo, for holding this hearing. Thank you to all of the witnesses. We really appreciate your expertise and your being here. And Mr. Wessel, I have a number of questions for you. So let me start by asking you a question about supply chain resiliency. As you know, the pandemic has laid bare vulnerabilities in our supply chains and highlighted the importance of making strategically critical goods here at home. And I've also heard from Granite Staters, including Gray Chenoweth, who is the CEO of a company called Minim. These Granite Staters have been impacted by both new and long-standing supply chain issues. That's why I'm working on legislation to help us bring American manufacturing back in critical sectors such as semiconductors, biotechnology, and military technology. In addition to these efforts, Mr. Wessel, how can the U.S. ensure that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework increases our supply chain resiliency?
As you just pointed out, and thank you for all your work on this issue, that in critical supply chain areas, we ensure first that we can make those products here in the U.S. where we can. Second, where we can't, we do so with allied countries that share our views and our refuse to weaponize supply chains, as we've seen with China. I think that can be a component of the IPEF agreement. But investing in our own economy, making sure that we can meet our critical needs, and working with our allies to make sure that we share the burden of providing those products globally to democratic nations is key.
Thank you. This is also a question to you, Mr. Wessel. I'm working on a bipartisan basis to promote research and development investment in the United States, including through bipartisan tax legislation with Senator Young. According to a recent report by the U.S.-China Commission, between the years, if I've got the years right, 2001 and 2017, U.S. companies increased their R&D investments in China at a faster rate than their R&D investments in domestic operations in the United States. So how can the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework balance promoting domestic R&D and strengthening ties with our allies in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, thank you for the question. And again, that goes back to your first point, which is first, we must make sure that we have the environment here in the U.S. to support R&D. It's not only work like you're doing on the tax code, but also the provisions that are in America Competes and Usmca that will ensure that we have the R&D base here that we need to make sure that it is not under attack by countries like China that engage in massive espionage. There are also cooperative things we can do with our partners in the Indo-Pacific. India, for example, is a major producer of active pharmaceutical ingredients and utilizing them in formularies, et cetera. We need to make sure that there's a balanced R&D strategy, but first and foremost, do what we can to have the core, the basic, and the forward-looking R&D being done here.
Thank you. And I want to follow up on something you just referenced, which was how we go about protecting our intellectual property. In addition to increasing R&D, protecting that intellectual property produced by U.S. R&D is obviously vital for promoting domestic innovation. That's why, as a part of any new agreement, we have to address the vulnerability of U.S. businesses to IP theft posed by policies like data localization requirements that require U.S. companies to store data abroad. What are the vulnerabilities to IP theft that U.S. businesses face in the Indo-Pacific, and how could a new economic framework address these vulnerabilities?
Thank you. IP is the lifeblood for workers here in the U.S. Labor led on the patent reform legislation a number of years ago, because if U.S. producers of IP and innovation don't have confidence in their ability to get a proper rate of return, they're going to either do the R&D elsewhere, or they're going to license it to countries like China, who will then undermine our long-term industrial base. We need strong IP protections in any agreement. We need to make sure that there is no coercive measures, performance requirements, and other provisions that other nations in the IPEF can use to still coerce, force U.S. companies to share their IP unwillingly.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
I thank my colleague. Let's see. Next would be Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Shaw, thank you for sharing your important perspective at this critical hearing today on trade in the Indo-Pacific region. I've been a constant advocate that the United States should be proactive with pursuing meaningful trade negotiations in the Indo-Pacific region, as it's an issue of national security. In my view, trade and national security are inextricably linked. China's move to initiate their own trade agreement in the region, followed by action to join the CPTPP, should be an important signal to Ambassador Tai that the U.S. cannot continue passive engagement in the region. Ms. Shaw, can you share with us some of the concerning actions by China to increase its influence in the region? For instance, how economic coercion or foreign direct investment from China will further undermine our economy?
Oh, thank you so much for the question. And I would need more than the remaining 4 minutes to catalog all the ways that China is continuing to advance its interests in the region to the detriment of our producers, our farmers, and our workers. But I will say you've highlighted RCEP, China's trade agreement, the largest trade agreement in history. Its application to the CPTPP, China is also currently negotiating a trade deal with South Korea and Japan, two important export markets for the United States and two important national security and military allies. So there is a lot of concerning activity on the trade front. In terms of foreign direct investment, China's foreign direct investment in the region, to put simply, displaces ours. In terms of economic coercion, that is unfortunately a tool that they have used. They have, in some ways, weaponized their economy to pursue political goals and to extract pressure and pain on countries that simply don't agree with them. Australia and Lithuania are two recent examples. And so this is very concerning, and it's very much the reason why the United States needs to lean in, needs to press in, and frankly needs to give the region an alternative.
Yes, I think that was a great summary in about 90 seconds about why this is indeed a national security issue. Do you see, Ms. Shaw, the need for urgency, how the United States approaches trade policy with partners in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly with ensuring that the Indo-Pacific economic framework is an effective and useful tool to bolster our relationships?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to be frank, we should be negotiating right now. The economic framework has not yet been launched, and it's not clear when that's going to happen, although the administration has indicated by the spring or summer. 6 months from now, we will still have an opportunity to engage. 3 years from now, we won't. The time is now.
Well, I agree with you. I don't see the same level of urgency, quite candidly, from the administration. And I'll do everything I can to support them should they lean into this important national security issue. Ms. Alonso, I'm encouraged that the administration is prioritizing digital trade by designating a module dedicated to digital trade in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Discriminatory digital trade practices stunt our economic growth and cause financial distress when countries, specifically China, require forced transfer of intellectual property in exchange for market access. I'm working on a digital trade resolution to complement the administration's strong efforts to promote integrity in digital trade. This will be a valuable tool in tandem with the digital trade initiative present in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Ms. Alonso, do you see value in congressional action supporting the administration's digital trade efforts? And more broadly, how important is it for Congress and the executive to be united when confronting increasing challenges in addressing digital trade barriers?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's absolutely important for Congress to be in coordination with the administration and for both sides to be operating in tandem in the region. The issues of security, both of intellectual property and of individual users' data in the region are very heightened. And so whatever can be done to ensure that not only there are important principles being advanced through the IPEF, but also to make sure that there are real guarantees for the safety and security of data throughout the region is critically important.
Very good. Lastly, I'd like to turn to an important position which the administration has not yet nominated someone to fill. It's the Undersecretary of Agriculture for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs. As our witnesses know, this post was previously held by Ted McKinney, who made significant strides to increase market access for American agriculture. Additionally, the Chief Agricultural Trade Negotiator nominee has been named but not considered by this committee. With input prices skyrocketing due to inflation, it's absolutely critical that Hoosier farmers have adequate demand from our global trading partners and that we continue to explore new market opportunities. So I'd just like to, in this public forum, emphasize the importance to me, to the people of Indiana, and really to the country to ensure that someone is nominated to that undersecretary post. With that, I will yield back to the chairman.
I thank our friend and look forward to working with him. Let's see. Senator Cortez Masto, I think, is next. I know she's got a busy morning.
I am here. Thank you.
Oh, there she is. Wonderful. Senator Cortez Masto, your time is yours.
Thank you to the panel. This has been an interesting discussion today. Really appreciate you being here. Mr. Wessel, let me start with you because you touched on it very briefly, but I want you to expand a little bit more when we're talking about digital trade. As you well know, Nevada is the entertainment capital of the world. We have so many creative artists there, and they are a major economic driver. But my concern is as we enter into these new agreements and these trade agreements, what should we be doing to really look out for the protection of creative artists? And what are the complexities surrounding that as we look to address digital trade in any framework as we move forward? Can you touch on that a little bit more?
Be happy to, and thank you for your question. My colleagues in the creative industries, there are 12 unions. As I understand it, there's more than $2 billion of income each year, which they rely on via the internet in terms of residuals, other payments, et cetera. So this is critical, and for many of the content workers, it's the difference between food on the table and not. I think we have to update the provisions and look at them very carefully. I mentioned Section 512 and Section 230. As the Patent Trademark Office recently indicated, for Section 512, it's unbalanced. The Senate Judiciary Committee is looking at that. I think we need to take a step back before we proceed in the digital area, have discussions among you and your colleagues, as well as stakeholders in labor and otherwise, to make sure that we have a balanced approach that ensures there won't be wage and compensation theft, while also promoting many of the other benefits of a digital economy.
I agree, and thank you. I think it is so important they're at the table. This is their content is really their livelihood, and they should get adequately compensated and protected for that content. So thank you, because I do think it is important that they are at the table as we are discussing trade. Let me jump to another area that is important for Nevada as well, and that's really our agricultural industry that we have in Nevada. And I so appreciate Senator Grassley's comments earlier involving agriculture, and it doesn't get left behind in any framework. Ms. Lawrenson, let me ask you this. Nevada's largest agricultural industry here, we export our beef, dairy, feed, and livestock. South Korea and Japan both buy more of these from Nevada ranchers than China does, which missed their two-purchase commitment of $80 billion for the years 2020 and 2021. I know you talked a little bit about some of the needed protections, and you had a whole list of them. Can I ask you, for purposes of protecting ag, including my ranchers and dairy farmers, is there anything in that specific list that we should prioritize over something else? Or can you touch a little bit on, in general, which one is the most important thing that we should be addressing in any future framework to protect our agricultural industries across this country?
Well, thank you, Senator, for that question. And I would argue, I think some of the toughest issues.
And I'm sorry. Oh, there you go. If you could start over, I couldn't hear the first part.
Sorry, Senator. I should know better, having lived my life with microphones in negotiations. Thank you for the question. And in terms of, particularly interests of your exporters, looking at the sanitary and phytosanitary barriers that we have in Asia, there are a number of phytosanitary restrictions on wheat exports, for example. But in the case of beef, you're also then looking at tariff differences where, Australia has a better tariff going into Vietnam than the U.S. So looking at those types of really concrete barriers to our exports and trying to get that level playing field, I think, is going to be critically important for your ranchers and your farmers.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Again, thank you for the great conversation today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank my colleague from Nevada. Next is Senator Barrasso.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, to you and to Senator Crapo for holding this hearing. Thank you all for being here today. Ms. Shaw, as we take a look at this tragic, unprovoked war in Ukraine, it's continuing to shock the world. We're seeing more nations realize really how energy security is tied to national security. Russia has demonstrated its willingness to use energy as a weapon. Countries around the globe are scrambling to find new energy supplies to replace Russian oil and coal and gas and nuclear fuel. America can and should fill that void that Russia is now providing. So as I look at the priorities this administration has laid out in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, I don't see anything that resembles a strategy to help our allies in the regions be more energy secure. In Wyoming, we have an abundance of coal, oil, natural gas, uranium, all of it. And I believe the U.S. can provide our allies in the region reliable, affordable, and secure energy resources. So this framework fails to address market access in any way and focuses instead on climate change and decarbonization of the energy sector. I believe it's a huge mistake. So how can we counter China's influence in the region if we don't aggressively export American energy to our allies?
Thank you so much for the question. This may not surprise you, but I completely agree with you. I think that the framework as it has been outlined and proposed is a modest step, but it is certainly not something that in its current form is going to really move the dial. I think we need to work closely with our allies where we have a competitive advantage. We have a national security interest. I think energy is a prime sector where we should be focusing our interests and our energies. But beyond that, we need to take on market access. We need to look at a broader scope of economic activity between the United States and half the world's population. We shouldn't limit it to very specific and narrow issues.
If I could go to the issue of trade, and in questioning and responding to Senator Young, I think you talked about trade. You said, I think the time is now, Ms. Shaw. So the Indo-Pacific region, critically important for American economic security and national security. So I think since backing out of the TPP, the U.S., in my view, has been on the sidelines with respect to trade. China, on the other hand, very aggressive in its efforts to expand trade and their influence in the region. So, and then I'm going to ask after you, I'm going to turn to the other two witnesses as well, or three. Given China's aggressive efforts in the Indo-Pacific region, just how far behind have we fallen, and how quickly can we move to counter China?
I'm going to do it later.
When it comes to trade, we are woefully behind. I mean, the trouble with TPP was that it was a flawed agreement. So while it was the right national security play, it wasn't the right economic play. But the world has changed a lot since 2016 when we withdrew, and the national security arguments for moving forward in a renegotiated CPTPP or something like that are much stronger. And I think that there are incredibly strong economic arguments for doing so as well. The further China goes in terms of strengthening its own supply chains in the region, the further behind we are. So economically, we are starting from behind, and we really desperately need to move ahead.
Okay. Can I ask the other witnesses to respond as well?
Thank you. Yes, I think, unfortunately, we are somewhat behind on advancing the open internet and digital freedom perspective that has been so beneficial to the United States economy and to so much of the world economy. China has made significant inroads in advancing its authoritarian model of internet governance. And so I think the United States really needs to show a vision for how an open internet really leads to more economic benefit and protection of human rights as a counter to that.
Thanks. Ms. Larson.
Yeah, thank you for that. And already food and agricultural exporters are falling behind in the Indo-Pacific region. For example, in Vietnam for beef and pork, or in Japan also for beef and pork issues and wheat and a whole bunch of other agricultural products. We are at a tariff disadvantage. While we, have high quality product, we also have, inputs that are costly. So we really need to be able to get to the table to negotiate lower tariffs and compete.
Well, following up on that, in Wyoming, we produce some of the highest quality beef in the world, and the Indo-Pacific region is critical for our beef export market and opportunities. So Japan, Taiwan, among others, continue to be major growth markets for Wyoming beef. In fact, in Wyoming even opened our only international trade office in Taipei a couple of years ago. So there continues to be great opportunity for Wyoming beef around the world. So how do we expand opportunities for Wyoming ranchers and farmers in the region if we aren't actively pursuing increased market access?
Well, I guess that's why I would answer that by we need to be pursuing improved market access. We also, I think a couple senators have talked about the need for an undersecretary of trade at USDA to actually go around the world and sell and promote the high-quality, cost-effective U.S. products. So a lot more can be done in this area with boots on the ground, meeting and talking and negotiating with our trading partners.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sure my time has expired.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. Senator Warren.
Mr. Chairman, if I just might have the opportunity to quickly respond to the senator's question, because I think America has stood up to China over the last number of years, both through the Trump and now the Biden administration. And President Biden's approach, which is to invest in our economy to strengthen America before we go back into the trade field in a major way, I think is the right thing to do. Both ensure that we go from a position of strength, but that we build American support, worker support for our trade policies. So I don't think we're behind. I think we actually have given an example to the world of China's predatory and protectionist actions. They more and more agree with us. They're cooperating. We need to strengthen our economy and then move forward.
All right, Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For too long, U.S. trade agreements have sold out American workers for corporate profits, and in particular, the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have helped offshore American jobs to countries that use child labor and deny workers the right to organize. So I'm glad that the United States withdrew from TPP, and I'm glad that the current U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, is committed to a worker-centric trade policy. But corporate lobbyists would like nothing better than to turn back the clock to the old failed trade policies. The administration recently announced plans to negotiate a new Indo-Pacific economic framework led by USTR and the Commerce Department. Now, corporations are heralding this as a new trade deal that will be the second coming of TPP. And comments from Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo raise real questions about whether she's putting workers first or instead trying to help out giant corporations. Secretary Raimondo has bragged that this new agreement will be, and I quote, even more robust than the traditional free trade agreement. Mr. Wessel, you chair a committee that advises the United States government on labor issues in trade agreements. So I know you agree that the goal of U.S. trade negotiators should be to protect and create good American jobs. Would modeling this new framework on old failed trade deals like TPP accomplish this goal?
TPP was unacceptable and is not the model for moving forward.
Well, I agree with you on this. Secretary Raimondo has also boasted that this new trade deal will be, quote, flexible and inclusive, allowing countries like Vietnam and Malaysia to sign up for some parts of the agreement, but not others. Now, Mr. Wessel, if this new trade deal is inclusive for countries that mistreat their workers and flexible by allowing them to opt out of the requirements to improve their labor standards, is that going to help American workers?
Only going to promote offshoring. And what we have said is there should be no cherry picking. Labor rights and corporate accountability must apply to all modules.
I agree with you, Mr. Wessel. And now the Commerce Department has just put out a request for comments on its plans to negotiate key parts of this deal, including building on supply chain resiliency. But while Commerce lists 9 priority issue areas, there is zero mention of workers' rights and worker protections. This is puzzling. I'm pretty sure that workers are at the heart of our supply chains, making critical products from cans to foods. So, Mr. Wessel, the U.S. clearly needs to build more resilient supply chains. But should we be locking ourselves into overseas supply chains rooted in places that use forced labor and suppress unions without any guardrails to raise their labor standards?
We need guardrails. We need to make sure that our critical needs are met here first. Resiliency to support our allies is fine, but again, we need to make sure that our needs here are supported. I believe President Biden is leading in that direction.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I have real concerns that this new Indo-Pacific economic framework, and I'm calling the administration to carefully consider its approach. It would be a huge mistake to listen to corporate lobbyists and negotiate a new trade deal that mimics TPP and that undercuts American workers. The Biden administration has promised to put workers at the center of its trade policy, and I want to hold them to that commitment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Let's see. Senator Bennett, Senator Scott, and Senator Thune is here. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding what I think is a very timely hearing. And before I ask questions, I just want to underscore the vital importance of having a chief ag negotiator at USTR. Farmers, ranchers, and producers in South Dakota and across the country deserve the best representation possible on the global stage. The Biden administration has had more than a year to advance a chief ag negotiator. If the administration is serious about helping American agriculture and American workers, it needs to stop dragging its feet and make filling this position a top priority. In year 2 of the Biden administration, the Indo-Pacific trade strategy appears, unfortunately, hollow. Trade promotion authorities lapsed. There have been no meaningful market access initiatives in the region, and America's exporters are losing ground to competitors. Meanwhile, China recently joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the world's largest free trade bloc, and now aspires to join the trade deal that America helped craft, but ultimately withdrew from, the TPP, or what is now known as the CPTPP. Without coincidence, of course, China is also becoming more aggressive militarily in the East and South China Seas. Ms. Shaw, if this lack of meaningful U.S. trade action persists, what impact will it have on our nation's strategic and economic interests in the Indo-Pacific over the next 5 to 10 years?
Thank you for the question. The results would be catastrophic, particularly if China does join the other regional trade bloc, the CPTPP. Part of the challenge that we're facing is that while on the one hand we're spending trillions of dollars well spent investing in the United States, some of our critical sectors, if we're not doing anything on the offensive trade side, what we're doing here domestically is going to be inherently less competitive in third country markets, and specifically the Indo-Pacific, where we have strong national security interests and strong economic ones. We are ignoring half of the equation, and I think it is critical both for our national security interests as well as our economic ones that we are coming up with a comprehensive and offensive trade strategy. At the moment, we just don't seem to have one.
How would losing out on market access in the region impact American jobs here at home?
Well, if American goods are less competitive and 95% of the world's customers live outside our borders, at some point we're not going to have anyone to sell our goods to, and that's really the problem.
So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is arguably perhaps a step in the right direction, but the proposal clearly doesn't seriously counter China or offer a durable advancement of U.S. economic interest. In the IPEF, tangible benefits are off the table, market access and enforceable commitments aren't prioritized, and the process doesn't go to Congress for approval or review. A trade pillar on digital trade, forced labor, and trade facilitation is hardly a grand strategy. So, Ms. Shaw, let me ask again, I know you've covered some of this ground already, but how can the framework be most improved? And let me ask a follow-up so you can just, are there other trade initiatives in the region, such as CPTPP, that the U.S. should pursue instead of or in tandem with this one?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. My strong view is that we should be pursuing a renegotiated and completely revamped CPTPP. Our CPTPP partners want us to be part of that agreement, and at the moment, we have leverage to make the necessary change that not only would it advantage our national security interests, but it would also advantage our economic interests. I think it's imperative that we put market access on the table, that we're tackling services, intellectual property, that we're moving forward and advancing the rules for state-owned enterprises. This is about the future of U.S. markets. And as I noted at the beginning of my comments, if all we're doing is investing here at home and not opening up export opportunities, we are missing the second half of that puzzle, and we are just going to be shooting ourselves in the foot long term as we lose out on third country market access opportunities.
Thank you. So using the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to resolve non-tariff barriers has the potential to help U.S. farmers and ranchers, especially as it relates to export markets for foods with common names such as Parmesan and Asiago. It can also help blunt the EU from gaining protection for geographical indications through trade negotiations. Ms. Lorenzen, how could the administration best preserve the rights of American food and beverage producers and reduce foreign tariffs in the framework?
Thank you, Senator. In my view, it's critical that the IPEF include market access to create incentives to actually reach market opening deals, and to achieve the types of things that you just mentioned, commitments that protect the ability of us to sell, cheeses with common names, or getting agricultural biotechnology regulations that work for our corn and soybean exports. You need real tangible results, you need incentives, and you need political will, and that really happens when there's an economic incentive in a negotiation to try and reach those deals.
All right, Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. Thank you.
thank my friend from South Dakota. Very important issues, and look forward to working with him as we've done so often in the past on trade issues. I think Senator Daines is next.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks to the panelists today. I think it's been stated a couple times, but it's worth reemphasizing. 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. Because of that, trade is essential, certainly for a state like Montana, as well as the entire country related to jobs, economic growth. The future is about kids and grandkids and access to these markets. I think I'm one of the few senators that actually spent a fair amount of time working on the ground in China, launching American brands once upon a time, so I've saw this up close and personal. It's also important we work with our allies to reduce unfair barriers to trade and ensure that our farmers, our ranchers, and small businesses are able to compete in a level playing field at home and around the world. Especially true given China's growing economic and geopolitical influence. It's essential that we work with our allies and partners across the Asia-Pacific region. Last year, I traveled to India. In fact, it was towards the end of the year, and I met with Commerce Minister Goyal. We were advocating then to reduce tariffs on Montana and U.S. ag, and we saw firsthand some of their leading technology companies. It's clear that India, I believe, is going to play an even larger role in the region for years to come. The U.S. should work to expand economic ties and consider entering formal negotiations with India, which presents an enormous opportunity for growth. It's the only other country that has 1 billion plus in their population as we think about our farmers long term, especially Montana's pulse crop farmers. Montana is the leading producer of pulse crops in the United States. India is the leading consumer in the world. If we think about other businesses that we can engage with India, in addition to just the strategic, regional, and geopolitical influence of India as a counterweight to China's growing influence. Ms. Lauritsen, in your testimony, you highlight India's high agricultural tariffs. How should the U.S. approach India and its many challenging and long-standing market access issues, whether it be on a bilateral or a multilateral basis?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And in the last couple of years of my tenure at USTR, I actually was negotiating with India to try and actually accomplish those very things. They are tough negotiators. They protect their farmers vigorously, but there are opportunities. First of all, they have retaliatory tariffs still imposed on some of our food and agricultural products as a result of the 232 steel and aluminum restrictions. That hurts our exports, including on pulses. But there are opportunities, I think, to engage with them. It's likely a kind of transactional, but you don't get anywhere if you don't sit down at the table and actually work through the issues. To try and lower their tariffs, even to our levels, would be of huge benefit to our exporters. We have a number of phytosanitary issues on wheat that could be resolved, for example, or agricultural biotechnology, ethanol. There's a long list, but you've got to be at the table, and you've got to have political will and economic incentives to achieve it.
Thank you. I've been sitting here listening. I know TPP has come up a fair amount, back and forth. During my time in the Senate, I've been a supporter. In fact, I called on both President Trump and President Biden to re-engage with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In fact, if you remember, it was President Obama that was an advocate of TPP, working more with Republican senators then. It was a unique kind of coalition to try to move forward on TPP. I think it's important both for economic benefits as well as part of a more holistic strategy as we think about countering China. Ms. Lauritsen, how has withdrawing from TPP impacted U.S. ag exports and access to markets in the region?
So because we're not a part of CPTPP, we are at an economic disadvantage for many products. While we have a partial agreement with Japan, we didn't succeed in negotiating elimination of all tariffs going into Japan. So that needs to be done, and we're losing market share. Vietnam, we also at a significant disadvantage, for example, beef and pork in particular. So not being a partner, we are at a tariff disadvantage. Foreign buyers are going to buy based on price, and it's important that we have lower tariffs so that we can compete against Europe, compete against Australia, New Zealand, and other countries.
Thank you. We've got time. I've got one more question from Ms. Lonso. You highlight many concerns about increasing digital authoritarianism around the world, particularly China, in its model of internet regulation. China's in the process of testing a digital yuan. While most countries that are looking into digital currencies are concerned about privacy implications, China's motivation stems in part from a desire to gain insights into the financial lives of its citizens. My question is, how could a push by the Chinese government to spread the usage of digital yuan outside of its own borders threaten human rights in neighboring countries around the world?
Yes, it's an excellent question, Mr. Senator Daines. I think the reach of China to be able to surveil the kind of transactions and interactions of people across the region would only grow with the export of or the push to spread the digital yuan beyond its borders, and it just highlights the issue, the really important needs of security and privacy technologies for all financial transactions that happen in the region, including strong encryption and abilities to resist that kind of surveillance and censorship.
Thanks, Mr. Alonso. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. Before my colleague leaves, I want to thank him for wrapping up his questions with that focus on digital and encryption. I did that as well. And for those who aren't aware, Senator Daines and I have worked together often on these issues, and I know we'll be applying some of what we've learned to the Indo-Pacific issue as well. And I thank my colleague. All right, Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm glad to see Labor here for the discussion. This is with a different president and a different chair of the committee, and thank you for putting labor at the center of all of this. We want, and my question will be for Mr. Wessel, we want a worker-centered trade approach that creates good jobs and raises wages, that rebuilds our industrial base, that looks out for workers' health and safety, and the safety and the cleanliness of our planet, that improves labor rights worldwide, something we've not seen in the past in this committee or in an administration in my memory. We unite in wanting, and I appreciate Ms. Lonzo's comments about that, we unite in wanting to counter China's labor and human rights abuses and its cheating in the global economy. This committee, this administration has put the world on notice. No more Trans-Pacific Partnership that ignores labor rights, as we saw in the last two administrations. Trade with the United States will be possible, but will be encouraged, but under very different rules from the past. The rules in any agreement matter. They matter for union steelworkers in Eastern Ohio. They matter for new solar energy companies in Northwest Ohio. I've asked the administration, and this was a great success of a bipartisan success, if you will, in the infrastructure bill for an equally robust Made in America economic framework. It includes infrastructure investments that we're about to implement. So my question for Mr. Wessel is, speak to what you would like to see the administration implement before, during, and after any trade agreement that we pass.
Thank you for your question, and thank you for your leadership on these issues. First of all, going to your point, this president has said that before he engages in new trade negotiations, he's going to build back the U.S. economy, and that's what he's trying to do. He did it with the infrastructure plan that's now being rolled out. He has been working with Congress on the legislation that's now gone through both the House and Senate and is ready for conference. Hopefully includes the provision that you and Senator Portman authored, Level the Playing Field 2.0. But we first have to rebuild our economy to make sure that we are approaching all of this from a position of strength. Second, we really need to have a better idea of what the administration wants to achieve with IPEF. It is still ill-defined, and Congress, along with other stakeholders, have to be at the table and need to be real partners in all of this. And then whatever provisions we're able to achieve, hopefully with your help, Senator Wyden's and the rest of the committee, they have to be properly implemented, monitored, and enforced. Too often we sign agreements and then move on to the next one without ensuring that we achieve the results that had been expected.
Thank you, Mr. Wessel. And talk for a moment about labor enforcement. I thank Chair Wyden for mentioning it earlier in his comments. I'm thankful to be associated with the chair on Brown-Wyden under USMCA and the difference. We took another corporate trade agreement and dramatically changed it with USMCA with Brown-Wyden and what that will mean. We've seen 2 elections in Mexico where workers voted overwhelmingly for independent unions, not the company unions in the past that we saw in Mexico and we see around the world. These 2 elections, the construct we build are going to help workers on both sides of the border in the long run. Our approach on trade policy in the Asia-Pacific region requires that same buy-in from the people who make this country work. So, Mr. Wessel, what guidance would you recommend to ensure that labor provisions included in Indo-Pacific economic framework are actually enforceable as they've been in Mexico?
Again, thank you. Not only thank you for your question, but the leadership that you and Chairman Wyden had on putting together the rapid response mechanism that is having a fundamental impact on labor rights in Mexico. You mentioned the 2 cases. Subsequent to that, the workers at the Mazda facility rejected a protection contract that was that their protection union was trying to force on them. So it is a model going forward. But that model was also built on all the work that you and so many others engaged in to make sure that the standards that are being enforced are worthy of all of our efforts. And that's a critical issue for the Indo-Pacific. We saw inadequate labor consistency plans in the TPP. Vietnam was a perfect example. So we must not only have the right standards and we must push forward, but we need efforts like you and Senator Wyden have promoted on the right kind of enforcement mechanisms and engage in new implementation, monitoring, enforcement efforts to support workers around the globe.
Thank you, Mr. Wessel. Thanks to the whole panel, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. And what's striking, and it's so fitting that Senator Brown is, I'm going to ask you one more question, but Senator Brown is officially ending the first round. And we know that different parts of the country for a lot of years had differences of opinion. In other words, the Midwest looked at these issues differently than the Pacific Northwest did. And what Senator Brown has been willing to do is to make, in a very transparent way, specific ideas that could bring the 2 regions together. In my part of the world, where our backyard is practically the Pacific region that we're talking about, people care deeply about this issue. And they know that a lot of trade jobs pay better. But what Senator Brown has said, it doesn't matter unless you have strong trade enforcement. So before you came, Senator Brown, Mike Wessel said, we're going to try to bring the same kind of approach to enforcement to this new area. Now, it's different. It is a different kind of issue. Each one of these trade debates is different. But the principle you brought to this committee, which is trade enforcement is important to workers in every nook and cranny of this country, is one I don't think we're going to turn our back on, and I thank you for it. All right. Let's wrap up with one question with respect to climate, if I might. And I think I'm going to ask you about this, Ms. Lauritsen, because I know you've had an interest in these issues, and it strikes me that the new approach we're talking about with respect to the Indo-Pacific is one that would give us a kind of less structured, perhaps more nimble approach where we could really get at this climate issue that is forgotten in too many instances. I mean, climate and reducing carbon is front and center to the quality of life and livability in our country and in the Indo-Pacific region. And it seems to me the project is an opportunity to pull solar panel production away from China's Uyghur region and bring an innovative approach to climate. So I think for my last question, tell me what you think of that. Are there opportunities here to make real progress with respect to tackling climate change that are born out of the fact that you don't have quite so much of the bureaucratic kind of set of requirements that almost ties our hands when what we really need is fresh thinking. What do you think?
Well, Senator, I actually agree with you. I do think that this provides an opportunity because if you can, the more you get other countries on board with even if it, general philosophies, but also bringing that concrete to actual practices, in the area I know of farming. It's, promoting resilient agriculture, being able to promote technologies that can help alleviate drought, whatever it might be, reducing the use of greenhouse gas emissions on the farm. This is an opportunity, but again, you have to be at the table and you have to have the incentives to bring these other countries along. They may not be ready to sign up on the dotted line right away, but you bring them along, you work with them, you help them, and that's an important way forward.
The three of you have been very valuable, and we thank Mike Wessel, who is, I think, still listening online, and just going to leave with one thought, and you all will be liberated and allowed to get some lunch and go about your business. So we've talked about big issues. I mean, hugely important issues relating to freedom and censorship and digital trade. We obviously keep coming back to more good-paying jobs in a variety of sectors, and that involves a whole host of questions. Supply chain issues obviously being front and center, and then we basically closed on the issue of climate, and that perhaps the kind of structure for this upcoming Indo-Pacific discussion may make it easier to tackle, climate change. And this committee is very proud of the fact that we basically passed legislation to transform the federal tax code in this committee. We took provisions on energy, threw them in the garbage can, and said, for the future, we're going to tie reducing carbon emissions to tax savings. So we're capable of looking at these issues in a different way, and you've given us a lot of good ideas. The key to getting it done, though, in my view, and you three touched on it with Mike Wessel as well, is having more open and transparent, discussions. I don't know if you all followed it, but the China legislation was really up against it for a number of days when we were trying to find a path forward on a bipartisan bill. Majority Leaders Senator Young. Senator Crapo and I had spent a lot of time talking with both sides of our dais with respect to the trade provisions. And when we got down to trying to advance the legislation, we offered a bipartisan amendment that had an enormous amount of debate among members of this committee. And it won 91-4. And then the legislation was on its way, and we're getting ready to work with the House. And I think it's going to be a bipartisan bill in the end. And it really stemmed from the fact that we had a chance in this committee to talk about various ways to craft legislation in a hugely important area, trade that you're talking about today. And thank you for giving us a lot of good ideas for going forward. I think everybody understands trade debates are not for the faint-hearted. People have really strong views, and they often come in with a great interest in keeping their view and defeating the other person's view. But as Senator Brown just talked about, we broke new ground in terms of labor enforcement. We can break new ground on climate. And you three and Mike Wessel have given us a lot of good ways to proceed. We thank you. And with that, Finance Committee is adjourned.